Live to the Moscow region, where President Vladimir Putin is making a statement on the crisis in Ukraine. Let's now listen in.
Yes, please.
Mr. Putin, I would like to ask, I'm from Interfax, because we waited for quite a while, so we accumulated a lot of questions. How do you assess the events in Kyiv? Do you believe that the government or the president pro tem are legitimate? At what conditions are you willing to support them and to maintain contacts with them? And do you believe it's possible to go back to the agreements of February 21, which we mention quite often here? Itartas, hold on a second. Russia promised financial support to Crimea. Yesterday, an instruction was given to the Ministry of Finance. Is there an understanding of how much we will give, from what source, at what conditions, and when this help will be provided, as the situation there is quite complicated? Hold on a second. Just wait a while.
Okay, don't hurry. I need to write it down.
When and under what conditions, I'm from Interfax, and in what amount, at what numbers will the military force used in Ukraine, and how does it match the international agreements with Russia? And the military exercises that just took place, are they in any way related to the possible use of military force? I would like to ask about Crimea. In your opinion, are they still provoking? Are there still any threats for the Russian citizens in the Crimea and Russian-speaking citizens? And is it developing towards the better, towards the worse? Because we've been hearing different opinions. Reuters, if you make a decision to bring in the forces, did you calculate the possible threats for yourself and for the country, such as economic sanctions and the global security and possible visa bans, or a wider isolation of Russia, which the Western politicians have been expressing, have been voicing? Please do not hurry. Do not rush it. All right. Darius Stanislavitz, Prime Agency. On the verge, the Federation Council decision to the historical minimum. Did you expect such a response, and what are the consequences for the economics? Are there any emergency measures required, and what kind of emergency measures are required? Also, do you believe that the central bank decision to the free ruble course was premature? Perhaps you need to cancel that decision or suspend it. What do you think?
Okay, I'll start to reply to these questions, and don't interrupt me. I'll try to reply as detailed as possible. Okay, so what is my assessment of what happened in Ukraine and Kyiv? So my assessment is that it's unconstitutional overthrow and an armed seizure of power. And no one has challenged that. Who's saying it's not true? But for me, there's a big question, and neither I nor my colleagues can reply to it. And you know, I've been discussing the Ukrainian crisis over the phone with a lot of our Western partners. Why has this been done? President Yanukovych, with the mediation of 3 foreign ministers of European countries, Poland, Germany, and France, in the presence of my representative, and it was our human rights ombudsman, Vladimir Lukin, they all signed between the opposition and the President Yanukovych signed the crisis settlement agreement, according to which, whether it's good or bad, I'm just giving you the facts. Mr. Yanukovych has almost lost all of his power. agreed to almost anything what the opposition wanted. He agreed to early parliamentary election, to early presidential election. He agreed to return to the 2004 constitution, and he responded both to our proposal and to the proposal of Western countries positively. He said he would not use force. You know, he never issued any command to shoot at the protesters. There was no such order, and he also ordered to pull out all of the interior troops, all of the police troops out of the capital. He went to a conference in the city of Kharkiv, and as soon as he left Kharkiv, the power was seized. Instead of unblocking some of the buildings that were seized, they've seized the administrative building and his residence. So why was that done? You know, he's given away all of his power. I told him he had no chance of re-election, and everyone agreed. All of my partners, all of my counterparts I talked to over the phone agreed with that. So why did you need to engage in those unconstitutional activities? Why do you need to plunge the country into the chaos it's still facing? And there is still some radical extremisms masked and armed on the streets of Kiev. So do they want to show their power, show their force, to undermine someone's dignity? These were silly actions, and it fired back. These steps led to the escalation of tension in the east of Ukraine. Now, to why it all happened, I believe it's a revolutionary situation, and I think the root cause goes back to the early days of Ukrainian statehood. Ordinary Ukrainian always suffered when we had Tsar Nicholas, when we had Mr. Kravchuk as president, and Kuchma and Yanukovich. And nothing has really happened. Corruption has now grown to such an extent, you know. Even here in Russia, even for Russia, it's unprecedented. The gap between the rich and the poor has widened. We do have the same problems, and they are relevant here, but it's even, you know, these problems have gone on to an unprecedented scale in Ukraine. Of course, people wanted change, but it cannot encourage illegal change. On the post-Soviet space, where you have fragile political arrangements, where economies are still burgeoning, you need to use only constitutional ways. So it's always a mistake to breach the constitutional rules. And I do understand those people at Maidan, although I don't welcome the fact of regime change in this way. I do understand those people who still demand not some facelift changes. They are demanding drastic changes. Why? Because they've accustomed to the fact that one scoundrels are replaced by other scoundrels and con men, and people in the regions don't take part in the formation of their regional power. We had a stage, you know, when the president proposed some regional heads, and the regional legislators approved that. And what we saw in the East now, that billionaires were installed as governors. And as like many here in Russia believe that these oligarchs have gained their fortunes through loans and shares, loans for shares auctions. And in Dnepropetrovsk, for example, they've got an oligarch, he cheated Russian Roman Abramovich. He just let him down, as they say. He framed him. They signed a contract, and Abramovich transferred $7 billion to him. And, he just pocketed the money and didn't deliver on his commitments. So I asked Abramovich, why did you do that? And he replied that, I never knew that could happen. I don't know what was the outcome of that scandal, but that took place like 2 or 3 years ago. That was a real situation. So that con man, he's now the governor of Dnepropetrovsk. Of course, people are angry. They were angry, they would still be angry if those who claim themselves to be the legal power are acting in this way. The main thing is to give the people the right to decide on their fate, on the fate of their families and their region, and to participate on an equitable basis. Whatever the region he resides in, they need to take part in shaping the future of their country. So are the current authorities legitimate? Parliament, partially yes, the rest are none. And of course, the interim president is not legitimate. There's only one legitimate president. Of course, it has no power, that's clear, but I told you about that earlier. From the legal point of view, it's Mr. Yanukovych who's the legitimate president. It's 3 ways, legal ways to remove president. It could be death, then his personal resignation, and impeachment is the third option, and that's part of the Constitution. And it's the constitutional power, the supreme power, and the Parliament needs to take part in it. It's a lengthy procedure. We have not seen that. So from a legal perspective, it cannot be challenged. Mr. Yanukovych is the legitimate president. And that's because I think the interim authorities have decided to dissolve the Constitutional Court. I think it's, it was illegal. And just think of it, they've issued an instruction to the Prosecutor General to open criminal cases against the judges of the Constitutional Court. Is that justice? How can you instruct someone to open criminal cases? It doesn't comply, it's not in line with the European standards. If there are any criminal situations, if crimes being committed, then the Prosecutor General's office has to step in on its own. As to the financial aid which could be provided to Crimea, as you know, Russia took a decision to ask the Russian regions to raise the funds for financial aid. As for the sources for this help, I can't give you the details. The government is now working with the governors of the regions which border Ukraine, but that will be done. As for the use of military force, there's no reason to do that. It's not necessary at the moment, but we have this opportunity. And the exercise that took place recently are not related to the situation in Ukraine. We have planned this exercise earlier, but we've not announced that because it's a surprise exercise of combat readiness. But it was planned a long time ago, and the Defense Ministry told me about that earlier, and he had all the orders ready. The exercise has been finished, and yesterday I ordered all the troops to return to their military bases. So what could trigger a possible use of military force? Of course, it's only in extreme case. As for legitimacy, as you know, the legitimate and President Yanukovych requested Russia to use the military force to defend the lives and health of Ukrainians. So our major concern is the orgy that is happening, and so many nationalists and radical extremists that are rampant on the streets of Kiev. And you, the media, might have seen that one of the regions was chained on a square, handcuffed to some fixture. In the winter, it was cold, it was freezing cold. He was later holed up in a basement. He was tortured then. So what's happening? How do you define that? Is this democracy? Is this an expression of democracy? He was appointed just recently in December. That governor, and even if all the authorities, are corrupt, as we might suppose, as might presume, has not been able to, rob anything. But when they seized the building of the Party of Regions, there was none there. There was just one technical guy there, and he told the protesters, we've got a woman, I'm an IT guy, I have nothing to do with politics. Could you let a woman out? He was shot dead right there. The second IT guy, was forced into the basement, and they threw Molotov cocktails at him and was burned alive. So when we see that, we realize what is a major concern for the Ukrainians, ethnic Russian and ethnic Ukrainians, Russian-speaking people who reside in the southern and eastern regions of Ukraine. So this is their concern, this lawlessness. And when we see that this kind of lawlessness starts in eastern Ukraine, and when they ask us for help, and we do have the official request by the legitimate president, then we reserve the right to use all of the means to defend these people. And we believe that this is legitimate. Perfectly legitimate. This is an extreme means. We believe, and we will believe, that Ukraine is not our closest neighbor. It's our fraternal nation. As for our armed forces, it's brothers in arms, friends. Many of them have known each other for many years. And I'm convinced that Ukrainian personnel and the Russian personnel will not be defending different sides of barricades. They will stand on the one side of the barricades. So that kind of unity is taking place in Crimea. And fortunately, there have been no shots heard, no victims. Well, apart from that incident which took place on the square a week ago. So what happened there? People poured in, they've blocked the military units, and they agreed that they need to take the oath of allegiance to the Crimean people. There were not a shot heard. There have been not a shot fired in Crimea. So the tense situation in Crimea related to a possibility of the use of force has been exhausted. There was no necessity for that. The only necessity we had is what we did is that we reinforced the defense of our armed facilities. They've been receiving threats, and we saw that some of the nationalist radical extremists were moving over to Crimea. We did that, and we did that promptly, and it was the right step. So we proceed from the fact that we will not be forced to do anything like that in eastern Ukraine. But I would like to underline once again is, well, we don't want to interfere, but we believe that all Ukrainian citizens, wherever they live, they need to enjoy the equal rights in terms of participation in the shaping the future of the country.
And if I were those who consider themselves legitimate authorities, I would hurry to take all the necessary steps, because they don't have a mandate to carry out Ukraine's foreign policy, internal policies, and especially deciding Ukraine's future. Now, a few words about the markets. As regards markets, you know, markets were nervous even before the events in Ukraine started, even before the situation escalated. And this is mostly to the steps taken by the Fed in the U.S. They decided that they made investments into the U.S. economy pretty attractive, and investors started withdrawing money from developing economies, moving their money to the U.S. economy. And this is a general trend. I think India suffered the most in other BRICS countries. Russia, too, a little less than India, but also suffered from this. This is the fundamental underlying reason. And as regards events in Ukraine, of course, internal affairs always and politics always have some effect on the markets. Money likes calm, but I think this is a temporary thing. Okay, next question, please. Известия. Did you expect such a tough response to Russia's actions from your Western partners? Could you please give us some details of your telephone conversations with your Western partners? And will the G8 summit take place in Sochi or not? Okay, what kind of reaction I expected, whether the G8 summit will take place in Sochi, and our telephone conversations. Our telephone conversations are confidential. Sometimes we even talk on secret lines, so I cannot tell you what we discussed with our partners and how we discussed them. I will mention some public statements by my Western counterparts. Without mentioning their names, I would like to comment on them in general. One thing we noticed is we are often accused of being illegitimate in what we do. And when I ask them, do you think that everything you do is legitimate? They say yes. Well, I can tell you, let's remember what the U.S. did in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya. They acted there either without any sanctions of the UN Security Council, or they distorted the meaning of UN Security Council resolution, as they did in Libya. The resolution only spoke about a no-fly zone, and eventually it ended with air raids, airstrikes, and their special forces participating in ground operations there. Our partners, especially in the U.S., always make it very clear what their geopolitical and national interests are, and they pursue those interests with much determination. And then they use this phrase, whoever is not with us is against us. And they use this phrase to make all the other countries comply with their will. And if some countries don't comply, they attack them, and eventually they make those countries regret. Our position is very different. We believe that we are completely legitimate in what we are doing. I have always supported international law, and once again, I would like to emphasize, even if I decide to use the armed forces, this will be a legitimate decision. It will be fully in line with the general principles of international law, because we have received a request from a legitimate president, and it will also be in line with our commitments, and it meets our interests, because we will be protecting the people we consider closely associated with us, both historically and culturally, closely related to us economically. This meets our national interest, protecting these people does. And this is a humanitarian mission. It is not our goal to conquer somebody, to dictate to somebody, no. But of course, we will not remain indifferent if we see that those people are being destroyed, humiliated, killed. I really hope that it will never come to this. On the whole, what do you think about the Western reaction to the events in Ukraine, threats, sanctions, and Russia being kicked out of the G8? Yeah, exactly. Okay, let this lady leave with her cell phone, playing music. Okay. Few words about sanctions. It is those who are going to introduce those sanctions who should think about consequences. In the modern world, where everything is interrelated and all countries depend on each other, of course you can cause some damage, but this damage will be mutual, and you have to think about that. That's number one. Number two, and this is the most important point. Like I said earlier, I explained our motives. And what are the motives of our counterparts? They have supported an anti-constitutional coup and armed seizure of power. They declared those people legitimate, and they support them now. Actually, even in this situation, we are open to cooperation. Like I said a few days earlier, I told the government to consider how we can continue having contacts even with those authorities in Kyiv whom we don't consider fully legitimate. We do our best to continue cooperation, industrial, economic cooperation. And so we think our actions are well-founded and all threats against Russia counterproductive. As regards the G8 summit, I don't know. We are preparing for the G8 summit, and we will be ready to receive our colleagues. If they don't want to come, that's up to them. I would like to add a few words about contacts. Correct me if I'm wrong. You said Prime Minister Aksyonov in Crimea is a legitimate leader. Are you willing to have any contacts with the people who consider themselves legitimate authorities in Kyiv? I just told you, you were not listening. Well, at the top level, I don't have partner. They don't have a president. And there can be no president until the general election. As regards Crimea, of course, the Crimean parliament was formed in 2010. As far as I can remember, I think it was December 2010. It includes 100 deputies, 6 parties represented in the parliament, 6 parties. And after the previous prime minister resigned, the Crimean parliament, according to the procedure and laws, at the meeting of the Supreme Council of Crimea, elected the new prime minister. Of course, he's legitimate because they have followed all the procedures in the law. There was not a single violation. But a few days ago, a group of armed people tried to seize the building of the Crimean Supreme Council. Of course, this caused a lot of concern for Crimeans. It seemed like they would like to do the same thing in Crimea as they did in Kiev. And they would like to start a series of terrorist attacks and chaos there. And Crimeans were alarmed. That's why they set up those self-defense committees and assumed control over all the armed forces. Actually, when I looked at all the military facilities that they now control, it looks like a huge military installation. A lot of anti-air defenses, a large number of troops, as 300, so on and so forth. But without a single shot, all this is now being controlled by the people of Crimea. People who blockaded military installation in Crimea were in uniform that looks very much like Russian uniform. Were they Russian soldiers? Well, look at the former Soviet republics, because there are a lot of uniforms that looks like you can go to a store, buy uniform. Were these Russian soldiers? No. These were local self-defense forces. And they're very well trained, because if you compare them to militias in Kiev, well, look at the people who operated in Crimea. They were, and I mean in Kiev. They were well trained. They were trained at special camps in neighboring countries, Poland, Lithuania, and also inside Ukraine. They were trained by special instructors. They were trained a long time because they have divisions. They're divided in hundreds and tens, and they have they're very well coordinated. They're very professional. They're just like special forces. Why do you think that self-defense forces in Crimea should be less trained? One more question. I'm from Bloomberg. Did Russia participate in training self-defense forces in Crimea? No. What do you think about the future of Crimea? Do you consider the possibility of annexing Crimea to Russia? No, we're not considering this possibility. And it's only up to the people living on a certain territory, if they can exercise their free will and they're secure, they can determine their future. And, for example, if Kosovo Albanians were allowed to do that, and actually people in many parts of the world were allowed to do that, self-determination, the right to self-determination, which is part of the UN documents, this right is still there, of course, but we will never instigate, we will never support such trends. Only people who live in a certain territory have the right to decide their own future. Two questions. You said these are extreme measures, the possibility of deploying troops in Ukraine, but you don't rule this out. But if you deploy troops there, a war may break out. Does this concern you? And my second question, you said Yanukovych did not give orders to shoot at people, but somebody shot at protesters, and these were snipers, professional snipers. Well, do you know that some people say, actually some of the protesters say that those may have been provocateurs from an opposition party. Have you heard about? No, I haven't. Well, look it up. It's available in open sources. So it's difficult to say who did what, but we all saw when riot police officers stood with shields, and people used firearms on them, and those bullets would hit a shield and pierce it, go right through it. And who gave those orders? I don't know. But Yanukovych told me he never gave those orders, and also, after he signed this agreement, he ordered to remove all riot police units from Kiev. Actually, I can tell you more. He called me on the phone, and I told him not to do that. I said, you will have anarchy and chaos in Kiev. Don't do that, but he still did it. And as soon as he did it, his office was seized, the government office, and then this chaos broke out, like I warned him. Are you concerned that a war may break out? No, this does not concern me because we are not going to go to war with the Ukrainian people. But there's the Ukrainian army. Okay, listen to me. Listen to me closely. I want you to understand what I say. If we make this decision, we will make it in order to protect the people of Ukraine. And how can army shoot at their own people? How can they shoot at women and children? Our soldiers will be standing in front of them. Who can give such an order? My colleagues working in Ukraine, basically every day, they say that the situation with the Berkut, with the riot police in Crimea gets worse and worse. For example, there is one officer who was wounded, and he's not being treated, and he's not even being fed. And there are families of those officers living in the dormitories, and they can't leave their house because there are people around them, people humiliating them. How can Russia help the families of those officers? Yes, this issue concerns us very much, because these are not Russian police officers, and we were not in charge of the situation there, but out of humanitarian considerations, it would be right for our human rights activists, actually, maybe we can ask Mr. Lukin alone or with some of his colleagues, because he worked on this agreement of February 21st, maybe with his colleagues from Poland, France, Germany. Maybe they can go and see what's happening with those Berkut officers. They did not violate any rules. They just performed their duty, and they were standing there under fire, gunfire, Molotov cocktails. Now they're wounded, they're at a hospital. I can't imagine this. How, even at the time of war, wounded people are being treated and fed, and now they don't feed them, they don't treat them, and they surround the buildings of dormitories where families live and humiliate them. I think law enforcement agencies should do something about that, and we would be willing to receive them in Russia for treatment. The Federation Council suggested that in response to a tough statement by the Secretary of State to recall the Russian ambassador to the US. Of course, the State Secretary is an important official, but this is not the top-level official in the United States. We saw statements by various politicians, members of various political forces. This would be an extreme measure, and if we have to do it, we'll do that. But I would prefer not to do that, because I think international cooperation, economic cooperation, security cooperation, it's not just Russia who's interested in all that. I think our Western partners are equally interested in that. It's easy to destroy these instruments of cooperation. It would be very difficult to recover them, to restore them. Russia helped Yanukovych. What do you think will happen to him next? Well, it's very hard for me to say anything. I haven't been following. I don't think he has a political future. And I told him about that. And then you said we helped him? Well, we only did this out of humanitarian considerations. Because death is the simplest way to get rid of a legitimate president. I think they would just kill him there. And actually the question is, why? What for? Well, how did this all start? What triggered this entire chaotic situation? It was that he refused to sign the EU association agreement. Today, it looks like nonsense. ridiculous. He did not actually refuse to sign the agreement. All he said was that we have analyzed thoroughly, and it seems like it would not serve our national interest. We cannot rise fuel prices for common people drastically because people are in a difficult situation as they are. We can't do this, we can't do that. We can't sever our economic ties with Russia because we are closely integrated with Russia. Like I said earlier, it's 7.5 billion out of 14 billion of their exports. I think 5 billion worth of export goes to Russia. So all the machinery they produce goes to Russia. Nothing goes to the West. And if now they sever those ties and they introduce Western technical standards in Ukraine that we don't use in Russia. Well, sometimes Russia will use those standards as well, but we haven't done this. This means that the next day, all economic ties will be broken, there will be unemployment, factories will shut down, and he said, we cannot do this overnight. And he did not refuse to sign the agreement, he just said, we need some more time to consider this document before they sign it. And right away, all hell broke loose. And was this unlawful for him to do so? No, it was perfectly lawful. He did not violate anything. They just used this as an excuse to support opposition forces in their aspirations to power. Actually, there's nothing wrong with that, but how can you take the situation to the situation of anarchy, chaos, and armed seizure of power? This is unacceptable. And our Western partners, it's not the first time they do this in Ukraine. I think they sit there across the pond in the U.S., sometimes it seems to me they feel like they're in a lab and they're running all sorts of experiments on the rats without understanding the consequences of what they're doing. Why would they do that? Nobody can explain it. The same goes for the first wave of protests in the Independence Square. Why did you have to do that? The third round of elections, Ukrainian politics turned into farce. There was no constitutional order at all. And people get used to this. They think if somebody can violate something, then other people can do the same. Then chaos breaks out. And we should teach our people to respect Constitution, the basic law, and all the other laws. Of course, this doesn't always work, but acting like this is extremely counterproductive and dangerous. So you said he's not legitimate and Rada is partially legitimate. What about Yatsenyuk and his government? Are they legitimate? And if Russia is concerned about radical elements getting stronger, they often get stronger if they face an enemy. And of course, they consider Russia as an enemy today. And Russia's position, the fact that Russia is ready to deploy forces in Ukraine. So, does it make sense, maybe, to talk to moderate forces in the Ukrainian government, for example, Yatsenyuk, and is he legitimate? It looks like you don't hear me. I told you 3 days ago, I told the government to resume contacts at the government level with their colleagues in different ministries of Ukraine to preserve economic ties, to support them in their efforts to restore the economy. I gave these orders to the government, and actually Dmitry Medvedev works with Arseniy Yatsenyuk, and Naryshkin is in contact with Turchinov, but I repeat, all our trade, economic, cultural ties, we will only be able to develop them entirely after the situation normalizes and the presidential election takes place. Gazprom said about going back to old prices. Since, no, Gazprom could not say that. Well, no, you did not listen. Or maybe Gazprom will not go back to old prices. Gazprom does not want to extend the current special price, because the agreement was to confirm them every quarter, and even before all those events started, before the situation escalated. I know how Gazprom talked to their partners, and Gazprom made an agreement, and the government of the Russian Federation made an agreement that Gazprom will introduce this special price, this discount, to $268 per 100 cubic meters. Then the Russian government will buy Ukraine bonds. Actually, this is like a loan. $3 billion as the first tranche. And then the Ukrainian government assumes the obligation to pay the debt that has accumulated from last year, and then to make regular payments for natural gas. They failed to pay off the debt, and they don't pay for the gas that they're using now. And if Ukrainian partners don't pay for February, the debt will grow even bigger. I think it's $1.5 billion as of today. And if they don't pay for February, it will be $2 billion. And of course, it's only natural that Gazprom say, if you don't pay us and your debt is ever increasing, okay, let's use a regular price instead of special price. This makes perfect commercial sense for Gazprom in their investment plans. Like any other major company, they have revenues, they have expenditures, and they have to plan ahead. If they don't receive anything from their Ukrainian partners, this means they undermine their investment programs, and this is a real problem for Gazprom, and this has nothing to do with the situation in Ukraine, with politics. They had an agreement. We offer you money, you make sure you pay regularly. We gave them money, we gave them this reduction in price, and they failed to deliver. So it's only natural that Gazprom says we'll no longer have any of this.
Well, Angela Merkel said that you agreed to send an international mission, fact-checking mission, and to come up with a certain contact group. But I said we have trained people who need to review this issue in a competent way. And they need to discuss it with the German counterparts. This is possible, generally speaking. I've given certain instructions to our foreign minister, who is supposed to meet, or maybe he's met already, with the foreign minister of Germany, Mr. Steinmeier. It will be on gender. Russia TV channel. Of course, we see a lot of attention to Crimea, but we also see what's happening in the east of Ukraine, in the city of Kharkov, Lugansk, and in Odessa. People are raising Russian flags over the administrative buildings. They're asking for help. They're calling Russia for help. Will Russia respond? Well, this is the kind of response. We've been discussing this response for an hour now. Well, many things that are happening come as a surprise to me. I won't go into detail right now, but this sort of response is expected. And our partners in the West, and those who claim themselves to be the interim power, well, they should have projected that. I told them 1,000 times, why do you divide the country? Why do you work to split the country? well, you know, they went the whole hog, as they say. Of course, people in the East, you know, they realize that they've not been consulted. Actually, you need to pass a new constitution, and it has to be approved at a referendum, so that all of the citizens of Ukraine feel they're part of this political process, that their voices are heard in shaping the main principles of the state order in their country. This is none of our business. It's up to the Ukrainians to decide, and it's up to the Ukrainian authorities. And once the legitimate authorities are elected, once a new parliament is elected, that will take place. At least I hope so. If I were in their shoes, I would approve a new constitution at a referendum. So once everyone votes for it, they will have to comply with it. If some people believe they've been not consulted, well, they will fight against it. But it's none of our business again. Will Russia recognize the president who's going to be elected? Well, it depends. If the same terror, if it takes place amid the terror that is happening in Kiev, then we will not recognize it. Well, we've heard some tough rhetoric from the West, but what about the Paralympics that Russia is going to host? Well, I think it would be cynical, highly cynical to boycott the Paralympics. We all know what that fund is all about. It's a sports forum, it's a sport festival, international festival, where people with disabilities can prove to themselves and to the whole world that they are people without any disabilities, that they have endless power. And they can use their sports performance to prove that. If someone's trying to disrupt that, it would only mean that people who's going to take these attempts have nothing sacred. Well, as for the hypothetical use of force, the West claims that Russia would violate the Budapest agreements, according to which territorial integrity of Ukraine is ensured. So, can regional and global players interfere into this conflict? Well, before we go public about something, or even before doing something in a practical way, you know, we think twice about it, a possible move, and we try to think about the consequences and the response from all of the players. As for the agreements you mentioned, do you represent writers? Yes. So, how do your, society assess this conflict? It is an armed seizure of power, and it runs counter to the constitution. That's clear. Well, I live in Russia. I'm a Russian. So maybe you appeal to the UK. Well, you should be. I think you could make a good diplomat. And the diplomatic language has been invented to disguise your thoughts. So when we say that it's an unconstitutional overthrow of power, they say, no, that's not like this. And maybe you've heard it many times. The West says that it's a revolution. Okay, if it's a revolution, what is it? Well, it's hard not to agree with some of the Russian experts who say that a new state could appear on this territory, just like after the breakup of the Russian Empire in 1917. And we have not signed any fundamental documents or any agreements with this new state. Well, something I'd like to clarify. If the US introduces sanctions, you said that it's going to damage bilateral relations. Does it mean that Russia could come up with some response that would slap its own sanctions? You also mentioned the discount for the natural gas prices. Well, what about those bonds, the government bonds? The first tranche was issued in late 2013. What about the next steps? What are the economic and political conditions for Russia to allocate these additional resources? In principle, we would be ready to provide additional funds to buy up more bonds, but our Western partners asked us not to do that. They said we need to work together within the IMF to stimulate the Ukrainian government to pass reforms to improve the economy. That's the way we're going to work in the future. But of course, given the fact that Naftogaz, the Ukrainian gas corporation, has not been paying, the government is now studying different options. Well, in general, I believe that the situation is balancing out. We need to send a signal to those who live in the south and in the east of Ukraine. They need to feel that they're secure, that they are part of the political process, part of the stabilization effort. Yes, please. You've mentioned several times about the legitimate elections. So who do you see as the candidate, as a compromise candidate? Of course you're going to say that it's up to the Ukrainian people, but, well, I have no idea, to be honest. Well, it seems the Ukrainian people are in the dark about their future president. They're all at a loss. I've been talking to lots of Ukrainians. Well, I have no idea. So after such a crisis, it's very difficult to give any forecasts. I don't welcome this way, this method of overthrowing the legitimate authorities in general, and for Ukraine, for the post-Soviet territory. As I said, it doesn't help to imbue the culture of legitimacy. I mean, it could lead to chaos. This is the worst thing that could happen to countries with fragile economies and political systems. In these conditions, anyone could come to power. So, some of the units, there were units in Germany which helped to bring Hitler to power. So that is one kind of analogy. So there's one thing I agree with Maidan. They are calling for drastic change. They want some fresh faces in the power. But there is a threat that someone could, some nationalist figure, some semi-fascist element. We've seen lots of people, with those signs, the armbands, with swastikas. So we had a statement that the Soviet Union falsified the documents on the crimes by the Bandera units, by the pro-Nazi units in this World War II. So, as I said, there could be some unknown, known personality who could grab the power that could have serious consequences. So Yulia Tymoshenko mentioned that she wanted to go to Moscow. We've had very successful cooperation with Ukrainian authorities who represent different political views. We worked with Mr. Yushchenko, we worked with President Kuchma, I worked as head of the government with Yulia Tymoshenko. I went to Kiev, she came to Moscow.
Разные были ситуации, связанные с осуществлением совместной деятельности
по руководству different situations. We had arguments, we had agreements, but that was kind of constructive work. If she wants to come to Moscow, she's welcome. But she's not the head of the government today, and I don't know what's her status, but we will not block her from coming to Moscow. One final question. Who's masterminded this regime change in Ukraine? As I said, it's all been well prepared. Of course, there were some armed units, and we've seen that they've been efficient. Of course, the Western instructors have done a good job. That's not what I want to say. If the authorities, if the power was strong and sustainable, no nationalists won't be able to engage in these pogroms, won't be able to get this result. But the problem is that none of the previous governments never thought about the needs of the people. We do have a lot of problems here in Russia. We do have a lot of similar issues, but they're not as acute as in Ukraine. So the average income per capita in Russia is 29.7 thousand rubles, and in Ukraine it's like 11.5 thousand. Our average pension is 10,000, while in Ukraine it's 5.5. It's half as much, and the World War veterans, get quite a decent pay. So there's quite a big gap in the living standards. That was the government should have focused on, and you have to fight nepotism in the economy. People are aware of that, and they feel distrust towards the authorities. And of course, that had kind of accumulated over several generations of modern Ukrainian politicians. And that led to the kind of disappointment among the people. People want to see fresh faces in the government. They want to see change. So that's the main breeding ground. That's the root cause of the conflict. But again, yes, probably you need some new faces, but you need to do it in a legitimate way, in line with the Constitution.
Will there be a referendum in Crimea? There are no ifs in politics. And I will be no exception. What about Yanukovych? Some people say he has died. I saw him once after he came to Russia. This was a couple of days ago, and he was well alive. And he will live longer than the people who circulate those gossips. Mr. Putin, do you think in recent months, when the situation escalated, what kind of mistakes did Yanukovych make? I will not answer this question. It's not because I don't know the answer, but I think it would be improper for me to talk about that. Do you sympathize with him? No. No, my feelings are totally different. A person who performs such obligations as the head of state has certain rights and has certain obligations, duties, and his biggest duty is to implement the will of the people who entrusted him with the country, staying within the boundaries of law. So you have to analyze whether he has done everything he could as he was allowed to by law and the mandate he received from his voters. You should analyze this and make your own conclusions. You said you have different feelings. Could you please explain? I'll talk to you in person later. The last question, we have to stop. Last question. Channel 5, St. Petersburg. You said that, first of all, we need to present our position to people in southern and eastern Ukraine. Of course, we need to make our position known to all the people in Ukraine. We don't have any enemies there. Ukrainians are our brothers. Do you know how many people moved from Ukraine to Russia last year? 3.3 million people. And 3 million of them came to Russia in order to get a job here, and they work here. 3 million people. Do you know how much money they send back to their families in Ukraine? Well, take just the average income and multiply by 3 million, and this is a major contribution to Ukraine's GDP, and this is a lot. And we accept all those people, even those who come from Western Ukraine, and we treat all of them like brothers. Actually, this was my question. We talk a lot about southern and eastern Ukraine, but there are Russians in Western Ukraine as well, and their situation is even more difficult because they're minority and they're being oppressed there. How can we help them? Well, we think that the current authorities, if they really claim to be civilized, should make sure that their citizens are secure regardless of where they live. And we will watch and monitor this